Last week on the podcast, I featured chapter 1 of The Fixer, and this week, this is chapter 2. In this chapter, we really start to get into the meat of the case that is going to drive the whole story forward, and we get to meet the primary client for Kirk Hoffman. If you didn't get a chance to listen to last week's podcast with the first chapter, I would recommend you go do that before you listen to the second chapter. And now, here is chapter 2 of The Fixer.
2. My drive back to the office was mostly uneventful. On my way, I noticed a green Ford Bronco behind me that I'd also noticed in the parking lot of the Denny's as I'd left, because I'd been torn between a Bronco and the four-door Jeep Wrangler I was currently driving. I need a GoPro camera in back, too, I muttered, glancing at my dash where I had the camera installed. Perhaps this was something I could talk to Anton Baker about, the tech guy at my law firm. Sensing something might be amiss, I took a detour, and the Bronco followed me. I was a few blocks from my office when it took a sudden turn and roared away. I mulled this over as I waited at the next stoplight and decided I was being paranoid. A few minutes later, I walked into my office conference room with my laptop in one hand and a water bottle in the other, my mind working through Dwayne Sachs's case even though I didn't know much about it. My wife said I was obsessive and told me I needed help, but I thought it was a good thing. The fact Dwayne had called my office killed my theory this was some kind of twisted publicity stunt. He was in real trouble. Did he do it? I wondered. My gut told me he could have because I couldn't forget the kind of character his father was. Dwayne might have been far more successful, but he was his father's son. These days, I never took on a client unless I was pretty sure they were innocent. I wasn't like other defense attorneys who needed to take everybody who walked through the door. I could be selective, and I took full advantage of that, turning away most walk-ins and seeking out my preferred clients. I always looked for cases where I could make a difference. Everybody on my team sat in their customary seats around the deep brown mahogany table. This room had no windows, and that was by design. Anytime I needed to have a sensitive discussion, I had it here. The walls were extra thick with soundproofing, and Anton checked this room and the rest of the office for bugs once a month. Precautions like that had become necessary because I occasionally worked with high-profile clients from all across the nation, hiring local counsel when needed. My wife had decorated the room with art that depicted famous scenes from history. Justice or mercy was the theme of every piece. She came in once a year and swapped things out to keep it fresh. It was a comfortable room, one of my favorite places to be. I loved nothing more than to be at this table with my team, dealing with complex and difficult problems as we sought to make the world a better place, one case at a time. An undeniable apprehension filled the air this morning. "Thank you all for meeting on short notice," I said. "What do we know?" Lux had brought them up to speed in my absence so we could hit the ground running. It was obvious from Troy Jackson's expression that he was excited about the prospect of this new client, but he was the only one. Troy wore many different hats, but his primary roles were to handle the boots-on-the-ground investigation and security. He was even-tempered, having spent time in Afghanistan and other places overseas during his time in the Army. Somebody groaned, but I didn't see who. Dwayne Sachs's reputation preceded him. Everybody in the room had already formed an opinion of Dwayne long before he called my office. That perception was prejudicing their view of the pending charges. This had the potential to be a contentious meeting. My people didn't hesitate to speak their minds, and while it didn't often cause problems, I didn't have time for a lengthy discussion. I wanted to minimize contention to get everybody's eyes focused on the right ball. Did he do it? Nothing else mattered, not today. Lux gave me a piercing look, seeming concerned that I wanted to take this case. "Dwayne's assistant didn't tell me anything we didn't already know from the news when they made the appointment," Lux said. Her blonde hair was pulled into a ponytail. She wore makeup dusted on so light that it almost wasn't there. She was 32 and had been working for me the longest. I'd hired her right out of law school because she'd impressed me as an intern. She hadn't been at the top of her class, nor was she a particularly gifted speaker, but she could hold her own in court and did a solid job. But that's not why I hired her. What she had was difficult to find. Drive. She was motivated and never quit anything. I'd take her over the top 10 graduates of her class any day of the week. Has anybody... Lux cut me off.
Have you heard from his father?
No.
He might pressure you to take this case. Don't give in.
I doubted that. If anything, Heath would tell Dwayne to find somebody else. We will hear Dwayne out, I said, and explore his case. I wasn't surprised Lux knew that I'd represented Heath Sachs, but I wondered how she'd learned of it. Maybe Dwayne's assistant had mentioned something. I'd never mentioned Heath Sachs to anybody on my present team. Nobody here but Anton had access to his file because Heath's case had been dormant well before I hired them. That case was long enough ago that I didn't keep the files here, storing them instead in a temperature-controlled warehouse with security measures that rivaled most banks. They were scheduled for destruction next year. I'd offered the original files to Heath, but he'd been satisfied with the digital copy I'd scanned from my archives.
We shouldn't take this case.
Lux's tone was becoming more adamant.
Even if he's innocent.
I hear you, but I disagree. Dwayne Sachs probably assumed my motive for practicing law was money, and that my services could be bought. Most of my clients couldn't afford to pay me, and that's how I liked it. We weren't a registered nonprofit, but I operated like one. I'd made my money on a mass torts case 10 years back, and had decided it was time to do what I'd always wanted. Practicing criminal law had been my one and only paramour, and it had beckoned me back. My wife had given me an ultimatum 4 years before the mass tort settlement, telling me I needed to give up my criminal law practice or she'd walk away with the kids. It wasn't that things had been bad between us. She just hadn't liked how I'd become so consumed by my job that I was never there. And while I was sure it was an empty threat, I'd taken it as a wake-up call and made the necessary adjustments to pursue a civil practice. It was the best decision I ever made, both for my family and my career, because I'd been a ball of stress, working 80 hours a week and barely making enough to provide for our family. Whenever I'd been with my children, I'd felt guilty that I wasn't bringing enough home to provide even the basic necessities of food and clothing. After the mass tort settlement, Tamara had been wary when I'd told her I was going back into criminal law, but she'd agreed with a few conditions. The primary one being that I had to restrict my caseload, something I'd agreed to do. I'd also told her at the time that I'd only represent people who I thought were innocent. She'd likely thought that was an aspirational statement, but I'd kept to it. And that wouldn't change today regardless of how much Dwayne Sachs offered or begged. But I would hear him out and look at his case. I owed him that much. We'd gotten so good at our jobs that I almost never found myself in a courtroom. I rarely took a case where I didn't approach the client and represent them for free. Every now and again I might take a paying job just to pad the office with additional funds, but it wasn't necessary. My investments were doing well, and I'd stockpiled enough cash to keep the firm running well past my expected retirement age, which was decades away if I had anything to say about it, though my wife had other ideas.
Are you going to take him on just because of his father?
Jessa Chen asked, giving me that piercing glare of hers that accentuated her pale blue eyes and black hair. At 26, she was the youngest on my team. She was also the shortest, but had a commanding presence, especially in front of a microphone. It's too early to say what I'll do, I said calmly. I'd expected friction from Lux, but Jessa surprised me. We all knew it was premature to talk about whether I'd take the incoming case, but I valued their opinion and wanted to take everybody's pulse. What are your early assessments? I asked, looking around the room. Lux spoke up.
Early reports are saying it was a fight with his former lover.
What's the victim's name?
Rebecca Shuffield.
Is she famous?
Lux shook her head. Mostly for dating him. She has an online following, but nothing like his.
Wealthy?
Her parents are. Her mom comes from money, and her dad's an investment banker. She'd been trying to make it on her own, but was struggling.
Where was she found?
In a hotel room.
Lux held my eye to make sure she was getting through.
At a hotel Dwayne used to own. He sold it last year. He was with her in the room before she was found dead.
She paused and looked around the table.
An anonymous source told the news they have him on a security camera in the hallway. He was the only one on the feed until Rebecca was found. It's an open and shut case, Hoffman.
So it would seem. But let's keep an open mind, I said.
The suite is on the top floor and was one Dwayne favored when he owned it. At least that's what an article in the Salt Rind papers is saying. Who knows if that's true?
Lux left no doubt what she thought. When did it happen?
Sometime after 9:55 p.m. last night when she called a friend.
Lux looked at her phone as it beeped.
Oh, no.
What?
Dwayne's closer than we thought. That was Wendy, his personal assistant. They're almost here. They want to know if they can move up our meeting.
Tell them that's fine. Do we know what time Dwayne was seen on video leaving her room?
I saw a report that said he left at 9:49 p.m., Jessa said. But the video hasn't been released.
And Rebecca was still alive at 9:55? I asked. Lux was getting impatient.
Look, the report said a camera showed nobody else in the hallway. Maybe Rebecca's friend is lying, or perhaps the news has some facts wrong. A video is damaging evidence, Hoffman.
I nodded. Your points are all good. This is why we need more information before I can make a decision on the case. You guys know how it works for the high-profile ones. We need to acknowledge our biases and set them aside. All of us have been biased by the vast amount of news coverage on Dwayne. I doubt anybody here has a good impression of the man. Am I right? I looked at Lux, expecting her to have an immediate opinion, but she shook her head, deferring to the others. She didn't care for Dwayne. That was obvious, which was something I'd have guessed anyway because he seemed like the kind of guy she'd roll her eyes at whenever she saw a headline about him. Troy cleared his throat but shook his head and said nothing when I glanced at him. He was 29 and just under 6 feet with dark brown hair and a runner's physique. His expression told me what I needed to know. He thought Dwayne had done this, but was eager to take the case anyway. He wasn't as motivated as the others to defend the innocent. He was always looking for a challenge. Anton shrugged as he looked up from his laptop. I admit it. I think Dwayne did it. He can't control himself when people are watching. I'd expect him to have less discipline in private. Anton's black hair was cropped close against his brown skin. He was 33. At 6'4" with wide shoulders and a broad chest, most would have thought he was my private investigator because of his athletic bearing and imposing presence. But he ran the computers and barely left the office except to hit the gym and get food. Jessa frowned, her petite face framed by her black hair. She was dressed like a news anchor, a job she'd aspired to until I'd hired her away from a local station by appealing to her yearning to make a difference.
I'd bet $1,000 he did it, and while I don't want to jump to a rash judgment,
Jessa glanced at Lux.
It doesn't look good, but I acknowledge we have no evidence, so I'll be open-minded.
Lux cleared her throat and studied me.
I know why you're asking, and I also know why you're thinking of taking this guy on. You feel you owe something to Heath for the time he spent in prison for a crime he didn't commit. I might not have been here when you ran that case, but I heard stories from the others. They said he blamed you for his incarceration, and that the man didn't even look at you as he left. You owe Heath Sachs nothing.
Heath's response that day had been a surprise. I concur with those who think Dwayne did it, I said, choosing not to respond to this last observation. I should have expected she'd heard about Heath Sachs from past team members, which seems to be everybody. Our justice system mandated that the accused were innocent until proven guilty, but I couldn't afford to make that assumption. I assumed the accused were guilty until proven innocent, but I refused to let any bias impede an investigation. Everything I know about Dwayne Sachs tells me I'm not going to like him now, I continued. However, he's intent on hiring us. I held Lux's eye. First and foremost, I help people. That's why I got into this business. When somebody asks for help, I have difficulty telling them no if I'm in a place to do something. So we'll do our due diligence.
Are you serious, Hoffman?
Lux asked.
I expected...
I shook my head as I cut her off, surprised at her trepidation. She really didn't like Dwayne. We'll hear Dwayne out and look at the case, but I won't decide how far to take it until we know more. I'll make sure he understands this. If what we're reading in the newspapers is true, we should be able to decide in the next few weeks after a preliminary investigation. Lux's attitude surprised me. She had a level head. Why was she so bothered? Did her bias go beyond what she'd read about the man? Everybody else nodded, satisfied with my decision.
If I could say something more,
Lux said.
It will hurt your reputation if you take this. That could inhibit us from pursuing your overall mission. Dwayne has gobs of money and can hire any lawyer he wants. You don't need to feel guilty about the past. Let it go.
Let it go, I thought. That's what I was going to tell you. Everybody but Lux averted their eyes. I'm not going to tell him no until we've examined the case. I was glad the others were supportive. There had been several times in the past where I'd told my team that I thought the client was innocent. Even though most had thought it went the other way, I'd been proven right. So far, my gut had kept me on my desired path. I hoped it wouldn't quit on me today.
The text of this production is copyrighted by Daniel A. Decker. The production is also copyrighted by Daniel A. Decker. All rights reserved.